tolerating Islam. Now, I just wrote a book. It's this year. Right now, this year, we have our first Muslim congressman, Keith Ellison of Minnesota. He insisted on swearing in upon a Quran. And he told his followers when he was sworn in, he says, you can't back down, you can't chicken out, you can't be afraid, you've got to stand up and be a real Muslim. He says, we're going to continue to face them. They're not going to stop right away, but if you and me believe in Allah, if we turn to the Quran, we'll have an answer to the questions we have. And so I turned to the Quran, and I found some interesting verses. For example, surah, and the word surah means chapter. Surah 551 says, believers, take neither the Jews nor the Christian for your friends. Here's Surah 517. It says, infidels are those who declare God is the Christ, the Son of Mary. And the word surah again means chapter or verse. Surah 573 says, infidels are those who say God is one of three in a trinity. Surah 4101 says, the infidels are your sworn enemies. Surah 9:123 says, make war on the infidels who dwell around you. Surah 47:4 says, when you meet the infidel on the battlefield, strike off their head. Muhammad is Allah's apostle. Those who follow him are ruthless to infidels. Surah 48:29. Prophet, make war on the infidels. Surah 66:9. Kill the disbeliever wherever you find them. Surah 2:191. Now, if a Muslim invites you to Islam and you say no thanks, and you try to defend your non-Muslim way of life, that's called fighting Allah. It says the only reward for those who fight Allah will be they will be killed or crucified or have their hands and feet on alternate sides cut off. Now, I thought, am I taking these verses out of context? Am I like being Islamophobic? Am I missing something? This is the book he insisted on swearing in upon, And so I thought, it really doesn't matter what I think. My question is, how have Muslims over the past 1,400 years interpreted these verses? And so that's what I did in the book. I put together the history. Muhammad was born in 570 A.D., and he was put together a faith that has a little bit of the Zoroastrian religion. The Zoroastrians of Persia believed in a sensual paradise with lots of virgins, okay? And they also believed in jinns, the spirit that would follow you around. A jinn or a genie. A genius was somebody that had a jinn follow him around, tell him all the answers. This was the Zoroastrians of Persia. This was their religion pre-Muhammad. And then in Mecca, they had the pagan religions, and they had 360 different gods, and the most popular was the moon god. They called Allah, who was married to the sun god, and they had three daughter gods, one of them Venus. And they had this rock they thought fell from the moon, and they would kiss it and walk around it and bow to it 5 times a day, and 1 month out of the year they would fast toward it. This was pre-Muhammad in Mecca for hundreds of years. And then there was the Jewish influence, and since Muhammad was illiterate, his whole life he couldn't read and write. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was 6 years old. His grandfather and guardian died when he was 8, so he was taken in by his uncle, who was a textile merchant. They would go on camel rides, and he'd go to these different cities and hear about their different religions, and he'd hear about the Jewish oral traditions, the Talmud and the Midrash, but then he would hear about the Christian faith. And Encyclopedia Britannica says the gospel was made known to Muhammad chiefly through apocryphal and heretical sources. So Muhammad thought the Trinity was the Father, Mary, and Jesus. I mean, his whole life, there were a lot of heresies there in Arabia, and Christian heresies, and most of them were over the confusion of the nature of Christ. And, for example, Orthodox Christians settled that in 325 at the Council of Nicaea, that Jesus is of one substance with the Father. But in Arabia, there were the Nestorians, who believed Jesus was mostly God and just a little bit man. There were the Arians, who believed Jesus was mostly man and just a little bit God. There were the Docetists, who said he was completely divine and only appeared human. And then there were the Ebionites, who said Jesus was the Messiah, but he was not divine. Now, Muhammad was married to his first wife by her cousin, who was an Ebionite Christian priest of this heretical sect. And so you can see the influence that came upon him. And he had his faith, and it's all in the book, so I won't get into it all. But he went into Mecca, began to share his faith, and got rejected. So he fled to Medina, a Jewish trading city. Once he gets to Medina, he chops off the heads of 700 Jews that are there. And then he starts off, and he goes on 86 raids and 26 major battles. The stirrup. I was out there. They have a really nice saddle out there, with a stirrup. The stirrup was a brand new invention that the Muslims got before the Europeans did. The stirrup came from the Mongolian nomads, who would tie a rope around their little short horses and leave 2 loops hanging for their big toes because they would ride horse barefoot. That made its way to China by the 5th century. They made the loops bigger for your whole foot. And that made its way to Persia in the 6th century. And they put a wooden block on one side to help you mount the horse. And then they put wooden blocks on both sides, so now you could stand in the saddle and put the full power of a galloping horse behind your sword. So the Muslims developed these curved swords called scimitars. And they would ride on these Ghazi terror raids, and they would literally slice people in half while riding at a full gallop. And they'd attack the caravans and the trade routes. And During Muhammad's life, they conquered all the way from the Indian Ocean to Mediterranean. Muhammad died in 632 AD, and within 100 years of his death, the Muslims conquered all of North Africa. People forget there were 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa. In the 7th century, they were all conquered. The Muslims conquered all of Persia. They conquered all of the Holy Land, which people forget was Byzantine, Christian, and Jewish. And Caliph Umar came in 638 AD, surrounded Jerusalem, made them surrender. Caliph Umar agreed, though, not to kill the Christians and Jews if they agreed to be dhimmi status, second-class citizenship, very similar to the black codes that were passed in the Deep South after the Civil War. And so these dhimmi status, Christians and Jews could not pray out loud. They couldn't ring their church bells. They couldn't proselytize. They couldn't repair their church or synagogue if the Muslims destroyed it. If a Muslim walked in rude, they had to stand up and give them their seat. If a Muslim came by their house, they had to put them up for 3 days and feed them. Christians and Jews could not own weapons, couldn't own horses, and they had no legal standing in court against a Muslim. And this is still the way it is today in Pakistan and many of those Muslim countries. Anyway, the Muslims then conquered all of Spain with their chainmail-covered horses and their scimitar swords. And these Europeans, you read the story of these battles, and these Europeans would stand there in an open field with just their little pitchforks with no horses, no armor. The Muslims would just slice through there and chop them up. Anyway, they were finally stopped at the Battle of Tours in southern France in the year 732 AD by Charles Martel, just 100 years after the death of Muhammad. And this, once they were stopped from going to Europe, there was no other army all the way to Poland. And if they weren't stopped there, we'd all be Muslim today. But, so when they were stopped, they began moderate Islam. It says we're still going to conquer the rest of Europe, but it may have to wait till the distant future. You see, Muhammad divided the world into two houses, the house of Islam and the house of war. Now, Islam means submission, and a Muslim is somebody who has submitted, and a faithful Muslim thinks there will be world peace when the whole world has submitted to the will of Allah or become Muslim. Now, we think world peace is when different groups that don't believe the same thing just learn how to get along. A faithful Muslim thinks there's world peace when the whole world submits to the will of Allah or becomes Muslim. Now, a moderate Muslim thinks that's going to happen in the distant future. So just go ahead and get along with everybody now. But the violent Muslim thinks it's going to happen now, and they want to help make it happen. And so anyway, once they were stopped from going into Europe, they began to conquer Central Africa and conquer into China. And as they were conquering into China, they ran into the Mongols. You know, Genghis Khan, the Mongols, they had the largest contiguous land empire in world history. I mean, from Korea to Hungary is huge. But the Mongols would ride into town, kill the men, take the women, and plunder. And when they began to fight the Muslims, they realized that this new religion, they could continue to ride into town, kill the men, take the women, and plunder, only now do it with the blessing of Allah. So one of the Mongolian tribes called the Turkish Mongols converted en masse and began to conquer back west. So the Turkish Muslims conquered the Arab Muslims. We've got two different kinds of Muslims now. Turkish Muslims, and they conquered the Arab Muslims. Then the Turkish Muslims began to invade into Asia Minor, which is today Turkey. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were all in Asia Minor. They were all conquered by the Muslims. Asia Minor was where John spoke, where Paul spoke. They spoke Greek, the language of the New Testament. When the Muslims came in, they would take the boys from the Christian families and force them to become Muslim, put them in the Muslim army, and then put them on the front lines when they would attack the next Christian city. They were called Janissaries, and they were the most feared troops in Europe for 400 years. And if they were delicate, they went into the Muslim pederasty, their homosexual culture. The sultans could have 1,000 wives, and boys were considered spoils of war. They called it the sodomy of the Turks. Anyway, with the help of the Janissaries, the Muslims finally conquered Constantinople in the year 1453. Constantinople was the biggest city in Europe. It was where Europe and Asia met. It was the richest city, and it was where all the trade went through to get from Western Europe through Constantinople to get over to India and China. People forget, Europe traded with India and China for centuries. Marco Polo, you know the game the kids play around the pool, Marco Polo, he was an Italian who went to work for Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. They had trade, but the Muslims attacked the trade routes, attacked the caravans, attacked the Byzantine Empire, finally sacked Constantinople in the year 1453. Less than 40 years later, an Italian said, I know a shortcut to India and China, sail west. And Columbus thought the islands he discovered were around India, so he named the inhabitants the Indians. He thought that Haiti was Japan. He thought that Cuba was the tip of China. It was not until his 4th voyage he realized he hadn't found the place, but it highlights the fact that Columbus would have never, ever set sail had there not been a jihad in 1453 that conquered this 1,000-year-old Christian city of Constantinople. The Muslims continued to spread, and in the year 1600, there was an English adventurer soldier named John Smith, and he went to join the Austrian army, fought the Muslims for 5 years, was actually captured. They put an iron ring around his neck, and he was sold as a slave, and finally escaped, found his way, fought the Muslims some more. Then he went down and fought the Barbary pirates. And the Muslims controlled the entire Mediterranean, the southern Mediterranean. They conquered all Turkey. They captured Sicily. They were invading into Italy. And John Smith fought for years, and then he went back to England in the year 1605, and in 1606, Captain John Smith set sail to found the first permanent English settlement in the New World, Jamestown. And we all know Captain John Smith from there because Chief Powhatan captured him and he was about to kill him when 11-year-old Pocahontas began crying and saved his life, so we all know from there. Anyway, another interesting story is in 1683, 138,000 Muslims surrounded Vienna, Austria. There were only 10,000 defenders, and the Muslims were starving them out for 2 months, but that gave the Polish king, Jan Sobieski, 2 months to gather 80,000 Poles, Germans, Hungarians to come to the rescue on September 11th, 1683. They came over the hill, surprised the Muslims, sent them fleeing in fear, and within a half an hour they won the battle. An interesting story, they went into the tents of the Muslims and found these bags of beans, coffee beans, and they realized this was how the Muslims could fight day and night, this new drink, and shortly thereafter opened the first Vienna coffee house, and coffee spread across Europe. In 1789, America had now been born. America spent 20% of our national budget to ransom our soldiers and sailors that had been captured and put in the dungeons of Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli. And Thomas Jefferson was ambassador to France, and he asked the ambassador from Tripoli why they were jumping on ships with daggers clenched in their teeth. And he said, "It is written in the laws of the prophet that all who should not acknowledge Islam's authority were sinners, and it was their right and duty to take them captive." Anyway, when Jefferson became the third president, he got fed up, sent in our Marines, and they captured the Pasha at Tripoli and forced him to make peace, and so that's why the Marine song is from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. And the curve in the Marine sword comes from the scimitar swords that they confiscated. Anyway, John Quincy Adams in 1830 writes a story that as soon as they signed the treaty and left, a year later they started the war again. And when they were confronted, the Muslims produced that treaty that our negotiators signed in Arabic. And John Adams says, our negotiators, unacquainted with the language of the Quran, signed the treaty in both languages, not imagining there was any difference between them. But when the Muslims produced the treaty, it said that we had surrendered to them. So John Quincy Adams says, you can't trust the Muslims when it comes to treaties. Anyway, in the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire got behind the military curve, and Greece broke away, and Romania broke away, and parts of Bulgaria, and parts of Hungary and Poland broke away, and there was this little country called Armenia. Armenia was between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. They were all Christian. It's actually the first country to officially declare itself Christian. And these Armenians wanted to break away. And between 1915 and 1922, the Muslims killed 1.5 million Armenian Christians. Marched them into the desert until they died. State Representative Sally Kern was with me last week at Phyllis Schlafly's thing. And there's a Missouri State Representative named Cynthia Davis. And her grandfather was an Armenian. He escaped by being a 6-year-old boy. And he lied under the dead bodies in the desert for 3 days. And then finally escaped, and some Muslim family gave him a meal. The next thing you know, there's a rope tied around his foot, and they made a slave out of him. For 10 years, he was a slave. Finally, he was putting grain onto a ship, and there's an empty spot in a bag, and he climbs in it, and the ship takes off, and he gets off in France and carries the bag off. But they butchered. There was a Christian church in Smyrna from the Apostle John's time up until 1922. And remember the Tiananmen Square massacre, all these little freedom demonstrators in China, and as soon as America said, we're not going to intervene, they went in there and killed them all. Well, Woodrow Wilson's last effort of his life was to try to get America to adopt Armenia as a protectorate like Puerto Rico. And he went to the Republican-controlled Senate, and they said they did not want to get involved in some civil war in a Muslim country on the other side of the world. And when word reached over there that America would not come to the aid, the Muslims went in there to the city of Smyrna and drugged the Byzantine bishop out of his church, dismembered him in the street. They killed men, women, and children. Blood ran down the street, made the port waters red. There were American ships in the harbor. They could hear the screams. They could see the people running out and drowning because they didn't want to get cut up, but they had no orders to intervene. And then they took what Christians were left and sent them over to Greece. They left 100,000 Christians in Constantinople, but in 1955 they had a pogrom. They went in there and smashed all the windows of the Greek Christians, drugged the Byzantine priests out of their bed, ripped out their beards, and circumcised them in the street. Anyway, the Christians fled. Now today there's just a handful. There's a couple thousand Christians left over there. But you know how America was going to adopt Armenia as a protectorate? France adopted Lebanon and Syria as a protectorate. Britain adopted Palestine and Iraq as a protectorate, and out of that was birthed Israel, thank God. But we see that France gave Lebanon its independence in 1943. Lebanon was an 80% Christian country, Maronite Christian, Greek Orthodox, Greek Catholic. They set up a democracy. Then they went through a process called Islamification. So many Muslims moved in and had so many children because they could have 4 wives that they had more numbers, and they took over the democratic form of government, and then they passed laws against the Christians. And between 1970 and 1990, they killed over 100,000 Lebanese Christians over there. Anyway, I just thought I'd come and encourage you tonight.